Tonight, it is all about the law, including legal issues surrounding that horrific limo crash where 20 people were killed. Where can the families of the victims go for justice and compensation? Also, hundreds of kids who were separated from their parents at the border, they're still alone. And now, some as young as 2, they're being taken to court alone. Who thinks this is a good idea? A panel of attorneys will weigh in. Then, on the heels of the explosive New York Times report about Donald Trump's history of tax dodges, a former federal prosecutor joins us to discuss whether this will impact the Mueller probe. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. And we start tonight outside of Albany, New York, and the limo accident where 20 people were killed. Well, the head of the limo company, Prestige Limousine, has been arrested today and charged with criminally negligent homicide. State police announced the arrest just a couple hours ago.
The sole responsibility for that motor vehicle being on the road on Saturday rests with Naman Hussain. This charging document has one count, but it lists all 20 victims. Any changes to that will be done with the consent and on the direction of the Schoharie District Attorney.
Prestige has a history of problems and issues. Take a listen to Governor Cuomo spelling out just some of them.
The driver of the vehicle, the quote-unquote limousine, did not have the appropriate driver's license to be operating that vehicle. Second, that vehicle was inspected by the New York State Department of Transportation last month and failed inspection and was not supposed to be on the road.
And there are also a host of concerns about the basic stretch limos themselves. Now, these modified vehicles, they're not regulated by the state. What that means is they're not required to have side airbags, emergency exits, steel reinforced roll bars, basically all the safety precautions that could help prevent a tragedy. I want to bring in our panel to take a look at some of the legal issues surrounding this. Jim Kasuris, criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, sits on the board of directors at the New York City Criminal Bar Association, also frequently lecturing at New York Law School and the bar associations in both Queens and New York. Doug Von Oist, founding partner of Karsten Von Oist. He focuses on corporate misconduct. He was also selected by the Legal 500 as one of the most influential trial lawyers in the country. Mayo Bartlett, an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLLC and former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office. Okay, Doug, obviously there's a host of criminal and civil punishments that are coming to this limo company. But I have a broader issue, and you got into this among asbestos as an example, where nobody is looking out at different times in our country for the public or particular industries or whatever else. To me, nobody thinks that stretching a car by an additional 15 feet and not making safety accommodations, given the history of problems we saw in Long Island recently, just a couple years ago, we saw in San Francisco, where another wedding party, I think of 6 people died, etc. Now this happens upstate New York, and there's a host of other examples of this. Nobody can claim ignorance. And I thought of when we talked before about amusement parks. Somebody can die in an amusement park ride, and they're able to just take that ride and shift it to another one, put a coat of paint on it, and let it go because there's no federal regulations to this. And in this case, really no state regulations that basically supervises this industry. If I lost a loved one, or in this case, loved ones to this, forget about some scum fill in the blank here up in Albany that's running this in the back of a seedy motel. I want to have some action where I'm going to look at the people that should be looking after my safety but aren't. Do I have any recourse at the state level or at the agency levels that should be policing this to do their job?
Are you talking about suing the state or suing an agency?
Well, can I? First of all, can I sue a state?
Well, you could sue a state. I don't think you would sue them for their ability to regulate this industry. You could look at whether the road was maintained properly, whether there was proper signage, and you could bring a lawsuit about that. You know, it's funny when you say that. Everybody's looking at these people saying they had this very dangerous vehicle with no airbags. Well, that's not, that truck at one point passed inspection and was on the roads legally at one point, maybe not now. I mean, this is an industry that was looked at by the state, and they said, that's fine, we'll let this vehicle pass inspection, let it be on the road. So you can't solely look at the business. I mean, you have to look at the entire industry and the regulations.
So do you think the exposure for this, both criminally and civilly, is limited to only the limo company?
Well, listen, you have the driver personally in his estate. I don't know what assets they'll have, the company itself. But when you're talking about the company and you're talking about maybe a defect in the vehicle, maybe the brakes, things like that, there still has to be, you're looking at negligence. You're looking at whether somebody did something wrong or failed to perceive something that could go wrong. There has to be negligence there of some sort.
You know, on a macro question, Jimmy, we covered school buses, right? You know, it's funny. Your kid's in the school bus, and I'm driving my kids. If I don't have my seatbelt on, my kids don't have their seatbelts on behind there, I'm going to get a ticket, right? Meanwhile, school buses, a lot of them aren't even equipped with safety belts. God forbid there's an accident and children die in a school bus. Wouldn't I, even though the bus isn't mandated by law to have this, the rest of riders are? I'm trying to get to a point which is there ever any culpability when the people that are supposed to be creating policy to protect the citizenry, reasonable protections, not unreasonable, they don't do it? Is there any way other than people at the ballot box demanding here action that somebody faces punishment as a consequence?
Well, for the most part, the state of the law is that the failure to enact something that would make a bus or any type of vehicle safer is not going to be actionable. And yes, you're right. What needs to happen is your legislators need to look at situations like this and enact laws and enact regulations that make these vehicles safer. But Doug is right. In this instance, in the instance that you're talking about, you have to look at the bus company, you have to look at the driver, and you have to ascertain exactly what caused the accident. In our case here with the limousine, were all of those, not defects, but the failure to maintain that limousine, were they the cause of the accident? Or was it the driver just running a red light? I mean, we really need to find out exactly what caused the accident and do an accident reconstruction in order to determine in which direction you're going to try to point liability.
You know, Mayor, I can point to a bunch of different analogies. Drinking water, for example, what the people in Flint went through, and now even in Newburgh, they're looking at it in New York. What I'm saying is there should be a minimum expectation. We've talked about even schools. Like your child should have a right to an equal education and stuff if they're funneling funds to something else. It may not be illegal and may be immoral, but at a certain point, I guess it all comes down to the electorate and what do they demand. But as a consequence, it's so patently unfair that it becomes buyer beware. They got into a limo figuring it's safe. They didn't know that this wasn't steel reinforced, that there were no, exit areas, there were no airbags, for crying out loud here. Just because some dirtbag can get around because there's no regulations, no one policing it, it shouldn't be buyer beware when you get into these death traps.
Well, with respect to this limo, they acted recklessly also because they had prior knowledge that it didn't pass inspection. So when you do that, you even go beyond negligence, because now at this point you have wanton disregard of the facts concerning safety of the vehicle. But going back to what Jimmy said and what Doug said, we have an electorate right now that is enamored with the thought of not having regulations. And when you bring up a great point, you talk about Flint, Michigan, you look at Newburgh. Most people really like regulations. It's just that they don't want certain things regulated. But most people like to know that when you turn the water on, something that's toxic doesn't come out. Something doesn't catch fire because it's next to a gas station. You want to know that, when you put your child on a school bus, that if there's an accident, you have a chance to survive it. So a lot of it does come down to us as an electorate, but we have to really start to think about things instead of just saying, hey, I'm pro-business, against regulation.
We don't have enough time for it, but the amount of mass deregulation that has gone on in this country in the last 18 months, it is nuts. And with more time, I go to Doug, but he deals with the fact that if you don't have somebody writing regulations, by definition, people will continue to cut corners. And if there's no enforcement mechanism to make sure they're even abiding by what regulations there are, what do you think happens? All right. I just want to get that off my chest. All right, coming up next, you may not hear about it every day, but 200 kids who were separated from their families still have no idea where their parents are. And some toddlers, they're going before judges without even an attorney. We're going to take a look at just how insane things have gotten.